Okay, thanks everyone for coming. It's really an honor to have so many people tuning in for this really important conversation. So everyone, salam alaikum. My name is Carmel Abuzaid, and I am a member of the Palestinian Youth Movement, and I'm also a volunteer with the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. I wanted to start out the webinar by introducing both organizations. As many of you probably know, the Coalition for Civil Freedoms is an organization dedicated to ending the abuses of the US domestic so-called war on terror. CCF was founded in 2010, and it's a coalition of civil liberties and human rights organizations that are working to challenge the post 9/11 targeting, surveillance, and criminalization of Muslim communities. And in addition to that, the Palestinian Youth Movement is a youth grassroots movement of Palestinian and Arabs, and we are organizing across North America for Palestinian right of return and liberation. So for the past couple of years, PYM has been working closely with CCF to build the consciousness of our youth and our community about political prisoners. And as Palestinian youth in the diaspora, it's a strong belief of ours that there's a fight to free our prisoners overseas in occupied Palestine, but there's also the struggle here in the US. And it's important for our community to center the struggle of our prisoners in our movement building, wherever we find ourselves. So today we are joined by some very special guests. We have Tarek Ismail, who is a law professor at the City University of New York School of Law. We have Steven Salaita, who is a Palestinian scholar, writer, and intellectual. We have Mariam Abu Ali, who is the sister of Ahmed Abu Ali, a political prisoner who is serving life in prison in the US based on a forced confession given under horrific torture overseas. And we have Loubie Qutami, who is actually one of the founding members of the PYM, and she currently serves as an assistant professor of Asian American Studies at UCLA. So before I let these amazing speakers take over, I just wanted to situate our conversation a little bit. We have watched over the past couple of weeks, violent settlers, mob settlers protected by Israeli occupation forces, attack Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah and in Jerusalem, trying to ethnically cleanse them from their lands. We've seen the occupation forces storm and brutalize worshipers in Al-Aqsa Mosque, and we've seen the horrific assault on Gaza with over 250 martyrs. Of course, it's been incredibly distressing to watch all of this, but it's also been an uplifting moment to see the resistance to this all across of historic Palestine and across the diaspora. It seems to be an unprecedented time for Palestinian mobilization. It feels like this has been a renewed global response to Palestinian resistance to the ongoing Zionist occupation, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing that is happening in Palestine. So now more than ever is an important time as we enter the 20th anniversary of the so-called war on terror to examine the policies that targeted Palestinians in the US and targeted their speech and overall movement building in the US. We know that the Zionist project depends on the US for military support, diplomatic support, economic support, but there's also an important part of this that depends on media support, and the US supports Israel by attacking Palestinian thinkers, intellectuals, scholars, activists, and so on. And so only by breaking down what has happened over the past 2 decades to Palestinians and Palestinian organizers in the US will we be able to really step into this moment for Palestine organizing and really push the needle on Palestine activism and discourse. So yeah, this is hopefully, inshallah, going to be a great event. And I hope that the conversation will be very fruitful and that we all leave here feeling energized for the fight ahead. I'm going to hand it over to Tarek Ismail to start the conversation. And he's going to talk about the policies and kind of the legal framework that exists to silence and criminalize Palestinian voices and politics. So take it away, Tarek.
Thank you, Carmel. It's really a pleasure to be in this space with all of you. If you hear my voice shaking, it's because I, like so many of you and like the other Palestinians on this panel, have been shaken by the martyrs who we've lost over the past week or so, shaken by the resistance that we've seen to to Israeli aggression and apartheid, and really shaken by what feels like an irreversible shift in the way that we're working together. And I think this panel is one such example. So I appreciate all of you being here, but I hope that my co-panelists will pick up the pieces of whatever I drop. So with that, I'll get going. And I want to sort of call this part of the conversation Palestine as the tip of the spear. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So having worked in and on US counterterrorism policy now for the better part of my 10 years as a lawyer, more, I guess I'm getting old, I can say without a doubt that the edifice of the US war on terror, and here I'm talking about its language, its rationale, its legal infrastructure, and its tactics, was built on the back of Palestinians in the United States, advocating for liberation, and on Palestinians across historic Palestine and elsewhere in the diaspora, resisting brutal oppression, forced dispossession, and more than 73 years of violence. As I say, Palestine was and continues to be the tip of the US counterterrorism spear. I was talking earlier today with my friend Diala Shammas, who's a lawyer at the Center for Constitutional Rights, and we were saying, you know, it's well kind of appreciated that Israel tests out its military technology on Palestinians by brutalizing them, and then shows their efficacy to the rest of the world in trade shows as they sell that technology. I suppose it's less well known, though, that the US tests out its counterterrorism policy on Palestinians before doing the same in other avenues of its sort of political work through the counterterrorism sphere. And here I mean domestically, both the US sort of first trying things out on Palestinians and then building out, and internationally in terms of some of the use of language and legal infrastructures that we see. It's important here to note, though, that in neither instance are Palestinians just guinea pigs. The goal on both fronts is, of course, to test out policies, but it's also political. The goal on both fronts is to suppress and to stamp out Palestinian resistance, to hinder the struggle for Palestinian liberation, using basically absolutist tools, which are designed to leave no room for meaningful interventions by shutting down the discussion using labels that have no answers. So I want to talk about each of the four things that I mentioned briefly. I didn't look at the time when it started as a defense mechanism, but I'm going to try and get through this in 10 minutes and then pass it off to, I think, Steven or Mariam. So let's start with language. I mentioned language, rationale, legal infrastructure, and tactics. So why don't we start with language? For a lot of us who grew up in the shadows of the war on terror, it can feel like the language of terror and terrorism is sort of endemic to the way that Western states describe resistance by non-state actors. It kind of seems like this language has been around forever. Even those of us who were around before 9/11 may have forgotten a time before the proliferation of this language. But terrorism, and here I'm talking about like the normative concept, meaning this idea of a morally reprehensible strategy that must be defeated at all costs for the sake of saving the world from evil, that terrorism, as a concept, as a word, is only 4 or 5 decades old. Of course, it's been repackaged and repurposed over time, but this language and the experts who have come up using this language is only 40 or 50 years old. And of course, it's a self-perpetuating language, right? So once it gets started, it just can't stop. One federal judge says that there's a terrorism expert, and all of a sudden that terrorism expert shows up in 30 other criminal cases. You know, and so in her important work on disciplining terror, Dr. Lisa Stemnitsky traces the ways in which experts in terrorism sort of invented this language in the wake of Palestinian resistance in the 1970s. None other than Benjamin Netanyahu played a huge role in this at one of the founding academic conferences on the topic, where terrorism was sort of framed and defined as an attack on civilization for the first time. This is specifically at the 1979 Jerusalem conference of the Jonathan Institute, which is a think tank founded by our friend Benjamin Netanyahu. This sort of absolutist language permeates the way that Western audiences think about terrorism now, and in fact, the way that jurists do. So to cite one example for you, in a 2012 case, deciding on the appeal of Tarek Mhanna, who was jailed for material support for terrorism and remains there for translating books and putting them online. In a 2012 decision by the First Circuit Court of Appeals, Bruce Selya, who is the appellate judge ruling on the case, opened the decision with the following quote: "Terrorism is the modern day equivalent of the bubonic plague. It is an existential threat." This is a judge, right? This is a federal judge who's meant to be objective. I stutter because it's laughable. But you know, this is the language that a federal judge is using. Terrorism is the modern day equivalent of the bubonic plague. Of course, he wrote that before COVID, right? But you know, this is the language with which we are approaching this concept. And so I think Lubna will have more to say on this language topic later on, and I'm sure Steven and Maryam will as well. But the incorporation of this language into policy and law shuts down any effective debate and provides a rational basis for states to do whatever the hell they think they need to do to stamp out their political opponents. Daryl Lee has written brilliantly about this point in his recent book, The Universal Enemy. This phenomenon then sets the terms of a moral debate before the conversation has even started, right? A rational actor in the paradigm of the US war on terror first asks, in all of this fighting, who is a terrorist? And then policy decisions flow from there. And we'll talk about how the US government has made it easy to decide who's a terrorist by developing all sorts of lists so that you just need to point and you'll have a sense, right? And so this language sets the terms of the moral debate before the moral debate even begins. I won't spend much time here talking about the second point, which is rationale. But I do want to just nod to it quickly and share 2 quick points. The first point is that across the legal academy and the judicial sphere, the Israeli Supreme Court is considered to be the gold standard when it comes to engagement with the law of war, right? What is proportionate and what is not proportionate? Israeli Supreme Court justices come and teach at the fanciest law schools in the country about these topics, right? And so that then results in something like Ned Price, the spokesman for the State Department, stumbling when he's asked, and I had a link here that I was going to share with you, but we're running short on time, stumbling when he's asked if Palestinians have a right to defend themselves. He says any state has a right to defend itself, right? But of course, Palestine, as far as the US is concerned, is not a state. And so what are Palestinians left to do, right? Any Palestinian who's defending himself or herself or themselves is, there's only one set of legal infrastructure left to talk about the means by which they're defending themselves. And that rationale permeates violent and non-violent forms of resistance, as I'm sure we're going to hear from Steven, right? So that's language and rationale. Let's talk really quickly about infrastructure. And here we're talking about legal infrastructure, right? So the material support for terrorism laws were passed as part of the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, ADPA, in 1996, on the 1-year anniversary of the Oklahoma City bomb, right? The idea was we need to be tough on terrorism as we saw it in Oklahoma City, and so we have to do something about it. What ADPA did, though, is it created a regime of listing foreign terrorist organizations, right? And so the State Department maintains a list of foreign terrorist organizations and makes criminal the material support for those foreign terrorist organizations, and takes a very broad definition of what material support means, right? So Supreme Court decision, Humanitarian Law Project v. Holder, 2010, says effectively providing even yourself as a resource to someone on that list to engage in peaceful negotiations amounts to providing material support. So even before September 11th, I'll let you guess who showed up on that list, right? There were 21 inaugural members of the FTO list. 5 of them were Palestinian political parties, right? Hamas, PFLP, every sort of branch of the PFLP, DFLP, and so on. And you can look it up online. Just go to the State Department's FTO list. And you can imagine these are undesirable political parties. If the FTO list had been created in the 70s, you better believe Fatah would have been on that list, right? And so we're talking about sort of the political views of an affirmatively Zionist Congress and executive branch being set out through the criminal law, so that if you coordinate with any of these political organizations, you face years upon years in prison. And for what it's worth, the government has made it clear that this is not a theoretical exercise, right? Even before, again, September 11th, Abdul Halim Ashtar was monitored by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act Court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, in 1993, right? Even before Hamas was on the FTO list, a secret warrant was put out for his communications with people in Palestine. Dr. Sami Al-Arian was prosecuted in 2003, again, for coordinating with people on this list. Muhammad Salah, may God rest his soul, was prosecuted in Chicago along the same line. The Holy Land Fund had 5 members prosecuted for raising funds for zakat committees, to which the State Department provided funds as well. But the issue that the government took was that these guys professed a liberationist language that made them uncomfortable. The FBI had a whole unit dedicated to looking at Palestinian rejectionists before any of this started, right? And even if you beat your case, so Professor Ashar and Professor Al-Arian, both were punished for refusing to testify against someone else in a future case when it came to Hamas. So the legal infrastructure is there, and it's creeping. This isn't something in the past, right? You know, as much as criminal, like, so we're talking about the material support laws were passed in 96. there were only 6 prosecutions under the material support law before 2001. And after 2001, they started to skyrocket, right? You started to see hundreds of material support prosecutions. The first couple were of Palestinians because the information was already in the pipeline. They had already been, getting this stuff ready. The thing to know, though, is that now through AIPA, which is another congressional statute, these laws have promulgated so that individuals can bring material support lawsuits in a civil sense, meaning from person to person. So the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights was sued for allegedly supplying material support to terrorism by some cockamamie scheme that a federal judge just recently shot down. But imagine the energy it saps from an institution if it constantly has to be worried about this regime creeping onto their advocacy. So that's the legal infrastructure, and there's a lot more to say there, but it's worth just highlighting that. And finally, when it comes to tactics, this idea of the FBI knocking on people's doors, surveillance, all that stuff. If you watch The Feeling of Being Watched, a film by Asya Bindawi about surveillance in a community south of Chicago, Bridgeview, you'll see that the FBI has been surveilling and monitoring Palestinian communities since before September 11th. And I think there's sort of a dual kind of issue at play here that I think deserves saying out loud right now. On the one hand, many of these people who were prosecuted post 9/11 were Palestinians, or the things that motivated their work or their thinking to begin with was Palestinian liberation. And we understand it to be Islamophobic because it is, but we also need to describe it as anti-Palestinian in its essence, at its core. And the same has to be said about the flip side. Many Palestinians are unwilling to embrace people who were prosecuted in these sorts of cases because of rampant Islamophobia across the community. And so it's important to say, people who have been fighting for Palestinian liberation have been prosecuted and then forgotten by so many in the Palestinian organizing community because of that. So I want to highlight that. Quickly to say, though, that this isn't over, right? Like CARE Ohio just announced yesterday that the FBI is knocking on people's doors, asking about their activism in the streets, like over the weekend, right? So the FBI is doing that. We know from FOIAs that were uncovered by The Intercept that the FBI was monitoring the International Solidarity Movement, ISM, throughout the 2000s, right? This isn't over, and it's extremely important that we keep that in mind as we think about the way in which the war on terror is directly aimed at Palestinian liberation activists here in this country and abroad. So much more to say, but I'm gonna pass it to whoever is next, and thank you.
Thank you, Tarek. That was so insightful and really started off the conversation strong. Steven, do you want to take it over now and kind of talk about your experiences and touch on the media aspect and academic freedom and whatever else you would like to touch on, of course. And yeah, you're on mute, so just go ahead and unmute.
Got it. Thank you. If my voice isn't coming through clearly, please somebody intervene and let me know. Let me start by saying that it's an honor to be here, to be a part of this with such wonderful hosts and co-panelists. It's really a pleasure, and I'm especially grateful to the Palestinian Youth Movement and Lena and the Coalition for Civil Freedoms for working so hard to put this together. I want to acknowledge the tremendous amount of work they did to get this done. So Lena and Carmel got in touch with me and asked if I could speak a little bit about the kind of repression that I'm familiar with. What I'm going to say complements what Tarek had discussed, but it doesn't exactly overlap with it. It's what you could call maybe a complementary sort of repression, whereas Tarek is describing to us, repression at the highest levels of the state being worked through law enforcement agencies. I guess I'm going to focus a little bit on academic and media repression. Sometimes it happens less formally. Sometimes it happens in ways we can't always detect with FOIA acts and through the discovery of documents. So I'm going to get into that in a second. I wanted to start by saying that it's been an interesting few weeks, I think, for all of us, watching what's been happening in Palestine and in surrounding countries. And what really has struck me lately is the kind of energy that comes from movement on the ground and in the streets in Palestine. It's been a tragic 2 weeks. We've seen a lot of people murdered, including children. We've seen thousands of people made homeless. We've seen the circulation of the typical vicious racism that always comes along with Israeli war crimes and Zionist occupation in general. But to see Palestinians in the streets in the past 24 hours celebrating and smiling and waving their flags with such a sense of confidence has been, I think, remarkable for all of us whose origins are in that land or whose hearts are in that land. And sometimes I find that, the solidarity communities here in North America, in the United States particularly, can be a bit depressing. It's very often, elections this, the squad that, people chasing after respectability, chasing after rewards, chasing after mainstream acceptance. It often feels, this is just my opinion, I know a lot of you are going to disagree, but it often feels very far from the sensibilities in Palestine that we know from Palestine, that we see from Palestine. It often feels to me very, very American, for lack of a better description. And I've been thinking a lot about Fanon's theorization in The Wretched of the Earth, where he talks about the restorative properties of resistance and how acts of resistance can make us feel whole and make us feel human. And I haven't wanted to talk, on a podcast or at any of these sorts of events for quite a long time, since before the pandemic, because I didn't feel like in these environs there's much to say. But again, Palestine has filled me, and I think filled so many of us, with life again. And it's a beautiful thing to be able to articulate these forms of life, to want to speak again, to want to be active again, to be reminded so powerfully of why we decided to devote our hearts and our minds to this cause in the first place. Because in the end, it's a choice, right? It's not just a matter of genetics. We're making choices. And so this is something that I very much wanted to acknowledge or to bring up, that we can't always allow ourselves to be swept away in the currents of what's considered mainstream or acceptable in the United States, because very often we miss what's going on in Palestine. And by missing what's going on in Palestine, we very much restricting our range of sensibilities and our range of intellectual production. So having said that, and this I hope will tie into some of the comments I want to make here in just a second. I guess a lot of people, who would tune into this kind of event probably know that, my story with the University of Illinois. I was fired from a tenured gig, not unhired, by the way. It honestly drives me crazy when people call it an unhiring. It was a firing that has different philosophical and legal connotations, and I very much prefer firing for a range of reasons, mostly because it contravenes the university's narrative. Anyhow. This happened in the wake of another horrible Zionist assault on the Gaza Strip, right, in 2014. And a lot of us ended up getting punished in the wake of our protests and demonstration against that particular set of war crimes. But my problems with academe were not limited to 2014 or to the University of Illinois. I was also, more or less removed by donors and by U.S. politicians, by people working with the State Department. From the American University of Beirut a few years later, I was removed from a job that I had been hired from, and I haven't been able even to get part-time work, contingent work in the United States ever since. And so I've kind of in the intervening time period ended up sort of moving away from academia altogether, although I still keep up with it. I still have a lot of friends and colleagues there. But the point is that getting punished for supporting Palestinians is never a one-off event. And anybody who's been listed on the Canary Mission or has had to deal with university administrators as either a student or faculty member knows this. It's a lifetime problem that the Zionists don't throw a punishment at you, right, and then let you walk away. Once you've been marked for punishment, they're going to keep on punishing you until there ain't nothing of you left. All right. Ever since Illinois, they chased me down to Lebanon and got me in trouble there. Right, they've dragged me into court. And it goes on and on and on. They're relentless. They don't stop. And one of the reasons they don't stop, it's not just ideological, it's strategic also. And it's not just a matter of resources, it's a matter of sensibility, that they want to set a precedent of absolute fear, right? That we know that something horrible is coming if we dare to speak up on this issue, and that something horrible is going to trail us permanently until we are in the ground. And so part of our, I guess, errand as people in the diaspora in North America who are concerned with Palestine, we have to dig down into the deep reserves of our own fortitude, right? Because that's what we have. That's the kind of power that we have. Right? We don't have donor power. We don't have anti-Zionists all over the ranks of university administration or in the editors' chairs at various newspapers. We don't exist in centers of power quite in that way. So what's the one power that we do have? Well, the one power that we do have is our fortitude. The one power we have is our willingness to say no. I won't conciliate on this issue of Palestine. No, I won't recognize Israel's right to exist just because you've demanded that of me on the spot. No, I'm not going to sell out Palestinians in order to chase and collect rewards. No, my devotion is to the freedom of the Palestinian people, and you can send any punishment at me that you want, over and over and over again, and I'm not going to change my mind. And that is a form of resistance, that might cause individual suffering. It might not register, on social media, but it's its own living thing, and we have to keep it alive through the generations because it's fully of accord of the sensibilities in Palestine. And it's precisely that form of resistance that has allowed Palestinians to survive so many overwhelming efforts to disappear us from the planet. If you think about what you'll hear from people in Palestine when they're talking about their ancestral land, when they're talking about their aspirations and their future, they'll always say, this is something that I will never give up, right? This is something that I'm going to carry with me until the grave. And that the one power Palestinians have always had, right, wherever we are in the world, but I'm thinking of the Palestinians in the Arab world more than anybody right now, is the power to reject the Zionist project. And that's the one thing that Israel wants from us more than anything. It wants our approval. It wants our permission. And as soon as you grant that approval, as soon as you grant that permission, you've given away the last bit of power that you have, the only bit of power that you've had. It's a discursive power. It's not a power of weapons, right? It's not a power of economy, but it's a power of the spirit. And it's a tremendous power. Otherwise, Zionists wouldn't constantly be demanding that we recognize their existence, that we recognize the presence of their colonial state on our ancestral land. So I'm appealing to you, whatever you choose to do, don't give away that bit of power. Once you give away that bit of power, you're gone, all right? You have nothing left, right? They have defeated you. It can hurt, you can suffer, but there's also no reward like steadfastness. And that's what I want to urge of people. Now, I was asked to address this, and I'm not going to go over time. So, we'll have more time during the Q&A. And if you have something that you want to ask me that you don't get a chance to ask me, or want me to explain something, then be in touch by Facebook or Twitter, whatever. Lena can give you my email address if you want it. I'm not going to say it out loud here, but we can get it to you, and I'm happy to be in discussion with you about any of these things. Because you're going to ask, because people always ask, and they should be thinking about it. How are we going to avoid punishment? How do I advocate for Palestine without getting into trouble? And I really don't have a good answer to that question, because there really is no good answer. The only viable answer is an extremely difficult one, that there is no foolproof way, that there is always the possibility that you'll get in trouble. And I think you need to think, you can get into legal trouble, as Tarek is talking about, right? You can get into employment trouble. There are lots of ways that you can be targeted for some sort of recrimination. And I don't think it does anybody any good to deny that possibility. I think with our collective strength, and as we keep going, our power will better be able to balance theirs. But as of now, I think it would be borderline criminal to tell young activists that you can do this work and be just fine. That's very well true, but that's not necessarily true. All right, there's potentially all kinds of consequences, and you have to go in with your eyes open, right? And you have to do what you're comfortable doing. You don't always have to be a front-facing person, a camera-facing person for an organization. You can do work quietly, right? You can support people in the background. You can do legwork. You don't have to put your face in front of the camera, right? You don't have to put your name on your Twitter account. Right, for example, you have to do it when you're ready, right? And do it in ways that make you feel like you're making a real contribution. All right, I don't like pressuring people. You have to do X, Y, and Z. Do what you're capable of doing and what you're able to do based on your life circumstances in any particular moment, and those circumstances will change. As your life evolves. It might be different in a week or a month or a year, and then you make adjustments, mental adjustments accordingly. And always remember, though, this is the only, I guess, stricture that I'll put out. You're not in it for rewards. You're not in it for mainstream acceptance or mainstream adulation. If that's your motivation, then just stay away. You ain't gonna get it in Palestine solidarity work. You're just not. You'll get the satisfaction, the deep, profound satisfaction of being in community with some really, really amazing people. And then of course, with an amazing nation of people spread out all across the world, right? With our heart in Palestine, you'll end up doing deeply, deeply meaningful work. But if you're in it for rewards, if you're in it for affirmation or for respectability, stay away. That's not what this kind of work leads to. this work lead to a different kind of affirmation and a different kind of satisfaction. And if any centers of power are happy with what you're doing around Palestine, then you're doing it wrong, right? That you have to please the right people and piss off the right people. And I guess you don't need me to spell out, who fits into those categories. So I'm going to go ahead and shut up. Let me just say, I jotted down a line I wanted to put, and I'll use it to close, that whatever you choose to do and however you choose to do it in the spirit of Palestinian resistance and not on behalf of American exceptionalism. And Don, and we'll converse later, I hope. And I'll turn it back over to I don't know whom I'm turning it over to.
It's okay. Thank you, Steven. That was incredible. Thank you for sharing all those thoughts with us. Yeah, hopefully when we go to Q&A, we can hopefully expand on some of the things that you touched on for the sake of everyone. But now I'm going to turn it to Maryam, and Maryam is going to tell us about her family's story, her brother's story, and kind of bring in a personal aspect to how this war on terror and how this vicious attack on Palestinian identity and Palestinian philosophy for liberation affects families and is intended to provide a chilling effect to the community so they do not speak out for Palestinian liberation and so forth. So Maryam, if you want to take it over, go ahead. You're on mute, sorry.
I'm so sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much, Carmel. Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everyone. I am honored to be speaking alongside brilliant panelists, and I thank CCF and the Palestinian Youth Movement for inviting me to speak. My name is Mariam Abu Ali, the sister of Ahmed Abu Ali, who has been unjustly imprisoned for the last 18 years. And I want to talk about the undeniable overlap between Islamophobia and Zionism. Even when a particular case has nothing to do with Palestine. And I want to talk about the vilification of the Palestinian identity. So my siblings and I were born and raised in the US, and our story begins shortly post 9/11 in 2003. My brother Ahmed was passionate about Islamic studies, and he received a scholarship to study at the University of Medina. And in 2003, in the midst of a final exam, he was illegally detained by the Mabahith, where he was tortured and interrogated for 47 days. He was sleep deprived, he was shackled, he was beaten, he was whipped, and he was threatened with his family. He was threatened with decapitation, amputation, just horrific. It was absolutely horrific. After the interrogation, he was forced to read a confession, a written confession that was videotaped. And this confession became the cornerstone of the US prosecution's case against him. With that said, despite having obtained this confession, he went on to be illegally detained for nearly 2 years without charges. And it was only after my family's persistence and pretty much going through legal channels that he was finally brought back to the US. So Ahmed was brought back to the US and charged with terrorism-related charges, specifically conspiracy and material support. And in this case, it actually wasn't related to Palestine, it was related to Al-Qaeda. But being Palestinian Americans, having that Palestinian heritage, his Palestinian identity was brought up repeatedly to vilify him and demonize him. So even prior to being charged, when he was still being illegally detained in Saudi Arabia, often the press would would talk about him as a Palestinian American man, right? Even though his Palestinian identity had nothing to do with this. Same as when the trial was happening, the fact that he was Palestinian would be brought up, even though my siblings and I had actually never been to Palestine. And I specifically want to talk about a lot of these prosecutors who are pretty much right-wing Zionists, and they are on a witch hunt. Not just, I mean, specifically, you know, they're targeting Palestinians and Muslim Americans. But in this case, I want to highlight two attorneys. Gordon Kromberg, who was the assistant U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, and David Loffman. So Gordon Kromberg is a Zionist Islamophobe who is on a witch hunt. And if you look at his, he pretty much was the prosecutor on so many of these terrorism-related cases in Virginia, and our community was hit pretty hard. He actually was not the prosecutor in Ahmad's case, and that's because when Ahmad was detained in Saudi Arabia, an attorney asked Kromberg about Ahmad, and he asked him specifically about the possibility of Ahmad being brought back to the U.S. And Kromberg, and this is in a sworn affidavit, he smirked and he told the attorney, he's no good for us here. He has no fingernails left. So you know, mocking my brother's torture, and he's been on record. He in court. He's made some horrible anti-Muslim, Islamophobic statements, just really outlandish stuff. I mean, you know, I'm going to mention a few of some of the things that he said in court, but he's just, you know, he was a vicious prosecutor. But yeah, because of his statement, he was not the prosecutor in Ahmad's case, but his partner, David Loffman, was, who is also a Zionist. So in the trial, one of his other statements was in the trial of Ali at-Tamimi. Most people from the Virginia community are familiar with his case, or anyone who's familiar with, you know, these U.S. war on terror cases is familiar with Ali at-Tamimi's case. He pretty much said in court, if you are a kafir, Tamimi believes in time of war, he's supposed to lie to you. So, you know, he's made statements like that repeatedly, that Muslims lie, that Muslims are, you know, that it's, I guess they call it tuqiyya or taqiyya. This implication that Muslims don't tell the truth. And in actually the case of Dr. Sami Al-Aryan, when Dr. Sami Al-Aryan's attorneys wanted to move the date of the testimony, he responded to the request. So they wanted to move it because it was the month of Ramadan, and they wanted to wait until after Ramadan. And so he responded to that request by saying, they can kill each other during Ramadan. They can appear before the grand jury. All they can't do is eat before sunset. So, you know, there's just a sampling of some of the horrendous things he said in court about Muslims and Palestinians. And, you know, he's caused just immense damage to our community. And yeah, I'm sure there are prosecutors all across the US who have a similar agenda and who are similarly on a witch hunt against both Palestinians and Muslims in the US. So, and Sorry, I'm a little bit all over the place. I apologize. I have a lot on my mind, but I also wanted to specifically bring up the case of the Holy Land Five, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And it was the largest Muslim charity in the US. And in 2001, after September 11th, it was designated as a terrorist organization. The government seized their assets and shut them down. And the 5 key members of the Holy Land Foundation, oh, thank you. The 5 key members were charged with material support, and they were in a second trial, they were convicted in 2008. And even what's so interesting about this case is that the prosecution did not even argue that their charity funded any violence. Their charity funded schools, hospitals, orphans, social welfare programs. But because Gaza is under Hamas's control, because money is fungible, the prosecutors argued that these donations then freed up money for Hamas to commit violent acts. And so, cases like that, they terrorize our communities, and they discourage donations to the Palestinian cause, and they are meant to hinder our ability to mobilize around social justice issues around Palestine. So, again, in my brother's case, even though his charges had no relationship to Palestine, his Palestinian identity was brought up. And so, so sorry, I lost my train of thought, but I did want to say, and Tarek mentioned this, but many of the cases were, many of these terrorism cases were Palestinians, and as someone who's attended the families conference every year, it always strikes me how many Palestinian families are in that room, and again, even though a lot of the cases are not directly related to Palestine. So, and I'm speaking specifically about the Coalition for Civil Freedoms Families Conference. So yeah, I will end there and pass the mic.
Thank you, Mariam. Thanks for taking the time and to share the story about your brother and connect it to the other Palestinian prisoners who are suffering and in the prisons in the United States. And inshallah, every day we get closer to a liberated Palestine is a day closer to the freedom of your brother and the HLF and all the other Palestinian prisoners and the Muslim prisoners in American prisons. And I just want to take the time now to plug in what you said about CCF and the Families Conference and the way that they support Muslim prisoners in the U.S. There's not an organization like CCF in the U.S. who's supporting prisoners like them, and it's important that all the attendees continue to support the work of CCF, and because it's work that not many people want to take on, and a lot of these prisoners are forgotten, and so it's important to recognize that. Thank you, Mariam. I'm going to hand it over to Lubna, but before I do, I wanted to let everyone know that we have the Q&A open. So inshallah, after Lubna finishes her part of this webinar, we can go into Q&A. So if people could start messaging what questions they have for our panelists, that would be great. And Lubna, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Carmel, and thank you, Lena. The Coalition for Civil Freedoms and Palestinian Youth Movement. I'm really honored to be here with you all today. I just feel so honored and moved to be sharing the space with Tarek, Steven, and Mariam. All of your talks really resonated, I think, with me and with all of our attendees. So I just want to say that I'm going to read, because as most of us Palestinians, Arabs are feeling right now, it's been a very rough couple weeks, and we're all running on very low fumes, and this will just be the easiest way for me to communicate my thoughts. The title of my talk is called "Resistance is Justified When People Are Occupied." And of course, that is inspired by the chants that are being said across the actions that took place these last couple weeks across the world. Zionism has long cast the Palestinian as a dual character in its creation story. At once, the Palestinian is regarded as the subject that which must be exterminated, lest Zionist claims to historic Palestine, whether biblical or political, be contested. Palestinian history must be annihilated, its people forcibly removed from the land, its homes demolished, its names erased from world maps, its people's narratives scrubbed from history books, its villages shorn to rubble, its olive trees uprooted, its archives looted and burned to ash. In this scenario, the Palestinian is regarded in past time, if acknowledged at all. The Palestinian must vanish, just as Palestine fades away. This is perhaps the character that David Ben-Gurion willed into existence when he notoriously declared that the old will die and the young will forget at the onset of conquest. In this scenario, Zionists productively borrow from histories of settler colonialism across the world, their logics, tactics, and techniques, that which declares their settlement as a byproduct of celestial destiny, the God-given right to settle the lands of Palestine, and the political justifications that they are returning to a land from which they had been expelled as indigenous people, a so-called land for a people without land. This is perhaps the character that David Ben-Gurion willed into existence, and the Palestinian is simultaneously constructed as a second character in Zionist imaginations, that is of the backward, barbaric, bloodthirsty terrorist, that which stands in the way between Zionists and their realization of their settler colonial fantasies, and forces them into a position of defensive struggle. Those whom Israel declared its so-called independence from in 1948. Herein lies a divergence with other settler colonies. Take, for instance, the lands occupied by the United States. After competing European forces settled the lands of Turtle Island, waged massive ethnic cleansing campaigns against indigenous peoples, established a system of racial chattel slavery, which kidnapped Africans from their homes and sold them into generations of enslavement. In the final instance, the Declaration of Independence of the new state was framed as a deviation or rupture from the succeeding European colonial competitor, the mother colony, Britain. For Zionists, its Declaration of Independence was amorphous. Who exactly were Zionists declaring independence from in 1948? Anyone familiar with the early history of Palestine would presume that Zionists declared their independence from the horrors of anti-Semitism that ravaged Europe, Nazi Germany and Third Reich in the final instance, or maybe the British Mandate. But the so-called War of Independence of 1948 was never fought with such forces. In fact, it was never fought at all. The enemy, however, was discursively constructed, and it was cast onto the victims of the settler colonial enterprise, the Palestinians, they who became cast as the oppressors in Zionist imaginations. This week, a tweet circulated that brought to light the torturous truth of how Zionists made the world believe that, quote, villagers with rocks are oppressing a world nuclear power. But one can only feign surprise at how deeply Zionism has worked on a universe of discourses, as it has on the land, if we are not paying attention to the intentionality in which Zionism casts Palestinians in doubled up roles, both the indigenous vanquished and the racialized terrorist. While the erasure of Palestine and Palestinians has been a dominant logic that had driven Zionism's global PR machines at the time of 1948 Nakba onward, the latter was consolidated following the 1967 war, whereby Israel developed a robust legal and discursive apparatus that painted Palestinians as bloodthirsty terrorists driven by anti-Semitism intent on returning Jewish peoples to their status as the subjects of genocide in the first half of the 20th century. But a close reading of that period profoundly suggests the inverse. Between 1948 and 1968, Palestinians had exhausted every possible tool at their disposal to attain their rights, freedom, and dignity. They appealed to Arab states and the international community. They begged the world to reverse the injustice that had befallen them, which the United Nations had greenlighted. And yet their refugeehood, their denial of freedom, was exacerbated. By 1967, Palestinians had grown painfully aware that their Nakba, their catastrophe, was not an event of history with lasting effects, but an ongoing condition of catastrophe, hopelessness, despair, misery, refugee camps, dispossession, exodus, war, and oppression. And so it was that the Palestinians rose up to wage an armed struggle of their own in the wake of the 67 defeat of Arab states, accompanied by scores of publications that demonstrated their commitment to coexistence, to peace, and that their war was not against Jewish people, but as Zionism as a colonial enterprise. In March of 1968, a victory was declared at Karama on the east bank of the Jordan River. 300 Palestinian guerrilla fighters alongside Jordanian forces maintained a 32-hour standoff against 15,000 Israeli soldiers, demonstrating that Palestinians were prepared to fight life and limb, no matter the cost, irrespective of the military asymmetry between them as guerrillas and the Israeli war machine, and precisely because they did not have much more to lose and had exhausted all other avenues to achieve their return and freedom. 20 years had passed before Palestinians picked up their arms and declared revolution, earning for themselves a new place in history, no longer the victim pleading with international actors for resolution. This is what Yasser Arafat, very contested character in Palestinian history, but this is what he meant when he said, quote, "We achieved something very important. We were refugees, homeless. Now we are freedom fighters." The birth of the revolution was also a birth of a new people who would no longer comply with their own death and destruction. Following the victory at Karama, the Palestinian Revolution was born, and so was an intentional Zionist legal and discursive apparatus that criminalized Palestinian resistance under the banner of terrorism. Borrowing from the South African apartheid regime's 1967 anti-terrorism law and the scores of laws and talking points that the US had long practiced suppressing indigenous, Black, immigrant, and working class revolt, the Israeli state became a leading power in arms manufacturing and sales and building out the so-called counterterrorism apparatus. In deep coordination with their superpower allies, primarily the United States, policies rolled out that legalized surveillance, suppression of speech, cultural work, academic freedom, boycotts, and all other forms of resistance on Palestinians and their co-strugglers worldwide. In the United States, a continuum of such crackdown on Palestinians and their co-strugglers under the guise of counterterrorism efforts rolled out long before September 11th, as Tarek has talked about, under every US presidency and intersected with the policies bent on suppressing Black insurgency, indigenous insurgency, anti-capitalist, and anti-war movements. This included the Nixon administration's Operation Boulder, the Reagan and Bush senior administration's Operation Vocal Betrayal, the Clinton administration's adoption of racialized anti-terrorism legislation, George W. Bush's Patriot Act and special registration programs, the launch of the so-called war on terror, imperialist invasions in Iraq and Afghanistan, all the way through Obama's countering violent extremism program and the Trump's executive order dubbed the Muslim ban. And I won't get into the cases which I think have been talked about today, the Holy Land 5, the case of Dr. Sami al-Ariyan, even the case of Rasmiya Odeh, all of these fall within that rubric, the efforts to silence dissent on the question of Palestine and criminalize that activism and that dissent under the guise of counterterrorism. All along, the Palestinians and their co-strugglers have been subjects of containment, though the ambiguity of discursive and legal realms targets allows for an interchangeability of those subjects, a productive measure to obscure the war on terror as a project of colonial, racial, and imperialist violence. What's even more productive here is that it allows the US and Israeli war machines to declare terrorism as a green light for invasion anywhere, everywhere, at any time, and suppression of any other group that threatens their hegemony. case in point example of this is that once we really started to see a renewed movement fighting for the movement for Black lives, this is right before Ferguson in 2013, but after Trayvon Martin, that was the period in which the United States government listed Assata Shakur, Black Power icon, Black freedom fighter Assata Shakur, as the first woman on the most wanted terrorist list. So this is what I mean by saying the interchangeability of the targets of the war on terror. At the onslaught of the 2001 declared war on terror, an important realignment took place that secured a newfound global role for the Israeli state and a third character that Palestinians came to play in racist imaginations of Zionism's tale. The terrorist that which is being contained under siege and an increasingly militarized carceral regime. As Palestinians were already knee-deep in their intifada, their uprising, by the time of September 11, 2001, Netanyahu used the moment in order to declare Israel as the sole global expert prepared to lead the charge against terror for the so-called freedom, for the so-called free world. His speech, delivered 13 minutes after George W. Bush's infamous "with us or with the terrorist" speech, secured Israel's place as a leading counterterrorism political and economic actor. And so it was that the 20 years that followed, Palestinians have lived under the most egregious of militarized conditions, where Palestine is a laboratory for the development of surveillance equipment, crowd control techniques, weapons, border control technologies, prison expansion, militarized policing tactics, and more. After every incursion, Israel strikes up scores of contracts for police, military, and security collaboration across the world, exporting its expertise to oppressive regimes everywhere, particularly India, which is maintaining the most militarized occupation in the world as we speak, with 1 million boots on the ground, policing 8 million people in occupied Kashmir. The International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network reports that following the Israeli war on the Gaza Strip in 2009, the Israeli economy ballooned from being 4% reliant on arms trade to 25% reliant on arms trade. This number has steadily increased after every major assault on Palestinian life and land in the Gaza Strip since 2009. Such technologies now appear on the streets of the United States, including in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was murdered by the need of the neck restraint, which until today, no one has yet to explain where and how police officers were trained in. Yet we know the murder of Floyd using that technique was not an anomaly. The Minneapolis Police Department themselves self-reported having used the neck restraint, need of the neck restraint over 200 times since 2015, and over 40 times that resulting in victims becoming unconscious. What we do know is that Minneapolis police does have a long history of training and collaboration with Israeli forces. The war on terror interchanges its targets, geographies, and it is a protracted war, undefined by time or borders. Yet Zionism appears in all of its manifestations, and Israeli state tools are more often than not used. As we witness the budding insurgency in Palestine, it is incumbent on all of us to understand that Palestinians are not resisting because they are bloodthirsty terrorists of Zionist character, but because the international community has left them no other choice. And it is for these reasons that we say that resistance is justified when people are colonized and occupied. Such resistance takes place in various forms, as Dr. Steven Salaita talked about today: speech, cultural work, protest, boycott, divestment, sanctions, and self-defense. All are being criminalized by Zionism and the war on terror apparatus. This is precisely why big tech giants such as Zoom, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Eventbrite, Venmo, and more have all suppressed news of what is happening in Palestine, casting it as a potential violation of material support for terrorism or in violation of their hate speech policies, precisely because erasure and criminalization of Palestinians are central to Zionist settler colonialism, which sits at the heart of the so-called war on terror. Just as in '68, Palestinians are embarking on a new awakening, a new course of history, done with accepting their oppressed status and false promises. They are done accepting the Palestinian comprador class standing in as gatekeepers of colonialism. They are hungry for freedom and guided by love for land, life, and dignity and justice. Hope has been restored. Tenacity is being reignited. The new generation knows now more than ever that change can only be achieved through total decolonization and return, and they have drawn a line in the sand. It is now up to the international community to choose where they will stand. Thank you.
Thank you, Lubna. I think I speak for everyone when I repeat what Tarek messaged in the chat saying, please publish this, Lubna. So it's thank you for sharing your thoughts and words with us. I'm going to encourage everyone to add any questions they have to the Q&A. And I have one question prepared, and then I also want to open it up for the panelists to maybe respond or comment on something another panelist said. So you guys, I'm going to say my question, but you don't have to respond to it if you don't want to. You can say whatever comes to your mind. But so my question is that, you know, we've seen, obviously, like we've mentioned earlier in the webinar, that there's this kind of unprecedented level of public support for the Palestinian cause over the past couple of weeks. And it doesn't seem like, you know, a shallow expression of support, but a genuine commitment to providing support and intervention on the ground. And so, you know, we have a lot of solidarity, people in solidarity with Palestine across the world wanting to do their part for the Palestinian cause. And there's been a lot of push to you know, donate to Palestine, and people are experiencing obstacles, whether it be on Venmo or other mediums, to find places to donate to Palestine and provide kind of this support. And it's brought more public attention to the nature of material support laws and things of that nature. And so just kind of this awakening or consciousness of these dynamics has made me wonder if, you know, is there a reason to be hopeful that the days of muzzling speech around Palestine might be coming to an end? And when we say speech on Palestine, that means, you know, speech, donation, right to boycott, all of those things. And so what can our supporters do to hopefully undo the injustices over the past 20 years and bring them to an end, and bring like these issues to a stop? So yeah, that's kind of a general question, and you guys can comment on it or comment on anything else. I think the videos are moving around, but yeah, if anyone wants to take it over, please do.
I'll give it a go. I mean, I don't want to take the question in its entirety. You know, there are a number of issues there to discuss. You've raised some important points. I guess when you asked about feelings of hopefulness, you know, I sort of perked up because I've been thinking a lot about that. Probably we all have. I do believe there's reason to feel hopeful. You know, at some point, the mass of popular sentiment is going to make a you know, some sort of dent or impression on the centers of power in which Zionism is inscribed. But my hopefulness is cautious as well. I've been thinking a lot as I read through my social media feeds and as I participate in them, that we're going to see another round of punishments, just like we did in 2014, just like we did in 2009, when Israel goes on a rampage. You know, its supporters in North America and elsewhere are absolutely watching what we're saying on social media. They're cataloging what we're saying. They're looking for ways to manipulate what we say into sounding other than what we mean. And you know, that's just what they do. There's no such thing as Zionism without an apparatus of punishment. You know, you just can't separate the two. That Zionism doesn't actually function without it. The entire thing is predicated on ideological discipline. And so, yeah, there's probably reason to worry and reason to be hopeful. I tried to keep myself on the hopeful side of the ledger. in the end, you know, we still don't occupy centers of power. The disparities of power are still tremendous, but at the same time, it's really difficult to ignore the widespread, worldwide expressions of solidarity with the Palestinian people, and think that it can't lead to any sort of material gain, and that I hope that more of us will feel, you know, those of us in diaspora, in the North American diaspora particularly, will feel more emboldened in our work, knowing that the popular sentiment around the world is on our side.
Lubna, are you talking? Oh, do you want to talk? Or any?
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to be brief. I 100% agree with Steven. I do worry about renewed repression campaigns, whether that takes form in increased brutalization of Palestinians in the homeland, or increased, maybe not even increase, I don't even know how much more it can increase, but renewed assault on Palestinian free speech, activism, organizing here in the United States, which, you know, we already saw, you know, with the growth of movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, we saw huge retaliation in response, right? So I'm definitely concerned about that, but I do just kind of want to point out something that a lot of folks have been recognizing about this distinct moment, is not just about global solidarity rising up in unprecedented forms. I mean, a lot of the people who are out on the streets are people who've long been our allies, right? They've always been there. They've been doing the work in some way or in another, but maybe we're all doing it together right now. Maybe that's the distinction. I'm not sure, but I do think one distinction that we should pay attention to is the moment in Palestine. You know, this is a moment where we're seeing all three of our historic homeland geographies that have been fragmented from each other, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and 48 Jerusalem Palestinians rising up together. We're seeing Palestinians renew a collective articulation of our struggle as a struggle against Zionist colonialism, settler colonialism, rooted in the Nakba. It's not just about a siege in Gaza, not just about an occupation in the West Bank, not just about second-class citizenship in 48. And I think that this moment is bringing back like a very true articulation of the Palestinian experience on behalf of Palestinians collectively. You know, and yesterday I was on a panel, and this young woman from Gaza, she was just speaking on the panel for the DSA, was so inspiring, talking about, we Palestinians in Gaza, we saw our people in Jerusalem and we stood up. And then we said, hey, we in Gaza are suffering and we're waiting for the West Bank Palestinians to stand up. And the same thing happened with Palestinians across the world. And so I think it's a moment where there's a lot of renewed love amongst Palestinians who have been really struggling with the grief and trauma of 73 years of occupation and dispossession and internal discord, whether politically or socially. So that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to sustain itself, whether it would turn into a third intifada or not. But I think it's a renewed moment for this generation and the years to come.
I want to just build on what Lubna said, just to add too that I think as we consider the Palestinian geographies, it's so important that we continue to raise up Palestinians in Lebanon, Palestinians in Jordan, Palestinians in Syria, those Palestinians who have been rendered stateless for as long as the Lebanese state has existed, for sort of, in Jordan, second-class citizens, Syria, second-class citizens, as they make their moves as well under threat of repression in other ways than those of us in North America might be repressed. And so to me, it's so important to lift those up as well, just to constantly remember that this is, as you say, Lubna, a struggle not just against occupation, but against dispossession. And so many Palestinians are without not just a place to live, but without a state in the current iteration of of the nation state. And so it's so important to remember that, to my mind. And to your question, Carmel, a lot of people have been asking, so where do we donate, right? Where do we put our money? So put your money where your mouth is, first and foremost. And there are a number of organizations doing work on the ground who, we can point to at some point if necessary. But, the fact is, and Steven has so articulately described what happens to especially Palestinians who are willing to be uncomfortable and willing to sacrifice their comfort for the purpose of steadfastness and ultimately for liberation. And it shouldn't just be on Palestinians to do that. If there's a divestment campaign at your school, which I'm hoping that there will be another round of them, and I'm hearing already rumbles of that, be willing to take the charge as someone who's not Palestinian, to put your name on the dotted line. And this is not just about, by the way, like repression in the US. It's also worth remembering that people want to access their family in historic Palestine. If they put their names on a certain line, they may never be able to access them, right? Putting your name, the risk of saying something online for a Palestinian is not just, economic, academic, whatever. It also is just tangible. It means that you may not be able to go to your historic homeland because you tweeted something, right? Or because you called for divestment, or because you led a divestment campaign at your school, or whatever. So be mindful of that. To those who are asking like how they can support, there are places you can donate for sure, but be mindful of the risks that Palestinians have to take, whether it's here, elsewhere in the diaspora, or on the ground in Palestine, to take steps that you yourself could take. It doesn't mean you make the decision for them, of course, right? But it means that you can occupy a space so as to allow Palestinians to sort of do the work elsewhere, or to direct the work from behind the scenes that Steven suggested. So just to amplify that as an opportunity for support.
Mariam, do you want to touch on this question, or do you want me to kind of shift the conversation a little? You're on mute, sorry. Oh, there you go.
Sorry. You can go ahead and shift the conversation. I actually have to leave, but
Okay.
It was so nice being.
Do you want to give any closing thoughts? That's what I was going to say.
I'll leave that to my co-panelists, but thank you so much for having me.
Okay, thank you so much,
All
Maria.
right, thank you. Take care.
Bye. Let me just check to see if there are any other questions. Okay, so I think we're almost coming up at the hour. So I was going to hopefully give space to the panelists to share any closing thoughts. And maybe if you guys wanted to comment on anything else that someone else said throughout this panel, I think this would be the perfect time.
Sorry, Carmel, are you opening the floor to us, or?
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Respond to any closing questions?
I think, sorry, one second. I think we should maybe just share some final thoughts and wrap it up here, if that's okay, unless you guys want to respond to anything that you've seen in the chats, but it's totally up to you guys. But yeah, the floor is yours to share any final thoughts.
Yeah, I would just I just want to thank you all for all of your comments and for all of your activism, all the labor you do, all the speakers, CCF and PYM. I saw a question about Hamas. I clearly cannot answer that right now. We have very limited time, but I just kind of want to point back to something that Tarek raised earlier, something that I mentioned about interchangeability of the targets of the war on terror, something that Steven raised about the criminalization not being just about armed resistance, but being about our speech. It operates on the discursive realm. Like, we have to remember that Hamas wasn't created until the late 1980s. Before that, it was another Palestinian player. After that, it includes other Palestinian players. There is an apparatus that is trying to silence any voices or opposition to a hegemonic order. And there's an interchangeability that takes place depending on who that force is. As Tarek mentioned, Fatah was once on that terrorist list and then was dropped from it or was no longer on it, right? Based on concessions that were made. So I think it's very mindful that we need to think about that. And at the end of the day, we need to keep our support for justice, freedom, right of return, end of colonization, and our understanding that oppressed people should exhaust all mechanisms that they can to achieve that with the least amount of pain and grief and hurt and bloodshed. But that when things do turn into armed resistance, we need to understand it in the context of colonization, not in the context of two equal sides in a conflict. And thank you everyone for joining.
I just want to thank everyone for joining. Thanks especially to CCF and PYM, especially PYM doing the work, the real work these days, and really appreciate all of the behind the scenes work that you all do. It's inspiring to me as someone who can't count themselves as a Palestinian youth anymore. But nonetheless, I feel so inspired, and I appreciate you. So thank you. And to CCF for constantly beating this drum. I mean, one thing that I'll close by saying is, I grew up in Ohio, in Toledo, and we had protests like the ones that you've seen around the country regularly. I mean, we'd stand on the street corners and yell during the first intifada, the second intifada, and they're doing it now. And there are the people who would kind of flick us off and say, go back to where you came from. There were those people who would not pay any mind to us. There were those people who honked their horns as we went by, which filled us with a lot of hope. And then there were those people who sort of pulled their car over to the side of the road and actually got out and stood with us. I think that's what CCF is. There are those who see an unpopular cause and pull over to the side of the road and say, I don't give a fuck. I'm going to stand with these people. And so I thank you for doing that. And as Steven has said, that is what the struggle for Palestine liberation is. And we invite you to pull over to the side of the road, but know that a lot of people are going to flick you off while you're standing there. And that's what it is.
Well said. Steven, do you want to?
That's an excellent metaphor, Tarek, and I don't even know how to possibly follow it. That's the perfect metaphor. So just also take the chance to say thank you to everyone. I really learned a lot from everybody. I'm extremely grateful, to have joined you and to the folks who organized it. I guess I guess it's important to remember, where we derive life, and it's the nation that gives us life, and we give life to the nation. And it's despite all the heartache and the tragedy, there is nothing to me more meaningful or rewarding than being in community with like-minded people, being in community with people who care about the nation in the same way that I do. And it's an absolute gift to be able to commune with people you love and who love you in turn, and who are working hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder, to create a better world for all of us. And there's not going to be a better world unless Palestine is free. It's central to that project, and it's central to that aspiration. And I look very forward to standing shoulder and shoulder with everybody as we move into the future to what I hope are soon going to be better days. So thank you all.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you to our panelists. I just want to repeat something that Steven said earlier, that there's no reward like steadfastness. And I feel like that phrase alone will carry us through the coming weeks, months, years, until we achieve our goal of liberation and freeing our prisoners from the US to Palestine. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us, and inshallah we will talk again soon. Thank you. Bye everyone.